Hello, I'm Bruce Canepa, and I'd like to welcome all the Petersen Museum fans to our facility in Northern California. We have a rainy day, and of course it's all quiet with all that's going on in the world right now. I hope you're all healthy and being safe, so we're going to take you on a tour of our facility. The first part of the facility we're going in here is the showroom. These are all cars that we basically offer for sale. For us, it's all about quality, not quantity. It's about the history of the cars, the condition of the cars, how well they're maintained, how well they're restored, how original they are. We really only want to buy the best and offer the best cars in the world to our customers. I've always liked lots of cars, different kinds. Most people know I'm a Porsche fan first and foremost, but you know, I like hot rods and I like Shelbys and I like some Ferraris and I like Lamborghinis and I like trucks and I like motorcycles, so I guess I'm a car guy. I have been since I was 4, and I've always liked a little bit of everything. For me, it's more about the history of the car, the condition of the car, the quality, the performance, a little bit of all that. And then as we grow up and spend a lifetime with these cars, it becomes all about the people. And we meet so many great people. We've shared so many fun events with people. I think that's what we enjoy and look forward to more than anything at this point. And the car culture has grown over the years with all the historic car races and road events and car shows and concourses and cars and coffees. It's really made the cars a lot more popular and brought, you know, hundreds of thousands of people together. We're going to showcase a few cars before we leave the showroom. This is the new Ford GT, and these have only been out a few years. These are magnificent cars, this new car. It's one of the coolest sports cars I've ever seen. This particular car belongs to Chip Ganassi. There's a Chip Ganassi display at the Petersen ongoing right now. Chip is, he owns a championship Indianapolis car team. They've won the Indy 500. They won the championship numerous times. He has a NASCAR team, but he was also the team that brought the Ford GT back to racing 4 years ago now, and won the 24-hour Le Mans, won the 24-hour Daytona, won almost every major race. And this is his personal Ford GT, which Chip doesn't have time for road cars. Everybody asked me why he would sell his car. I said, well, he spends all his time in the seat of an airplane. He goes from his house to the Indianapolis shops to the North Carolina shops to the races. So, and if you ask him, he'll just tell you he's got plenty of cars with numbers on them in the shops. Here's another car that I really like, and as you know, I've told you I'm a Porsche fan. This is a 964 RS. These are extremely rare. This particular car belonged to Jerry Seinfeld. We've done a number of cars with Jerry over the years. Unfortunately, he sometimes has too many cars, so we get some of them back. But this is a very, very low mileage, extremely rare color. And the 964 RS is really the modern day Carrera RS. It's light, it has great horsepower, handles amazing, sounds great. It's an air-cooled car. It really kind of checks every box for what a sports car should be. A couple of cool things before we go. This is a McLaren P1 GTR. There's only a little over 50 of these in the world. It's a 1,000 horsepower car. It's just an amazing piece of equipment in terms of handling and performance. It's a 0 to 60, just over 2-second car. I can't say enough about it. They're awesome. And I think they're awesome looking too. McLaren has done such an incredible job getting into the car world and coming up with some great road cars in such a short period of time. On the other side here is a BMW M1. I had the first one of these that I owned was in 1981. I've always liked this car. It's BMW's only supercar in their whole history. It was a composite body car. It was very lightweight, had overhead cam, 300 horsepower engine, and design-wise, they're timeless. And drivability, they're awesome. They really drive more like a modern car than an 80s car. And then the last thing I'm going to point out is the two Cobras. I've been a Cobra fan since the late 60s. These were always dream cars for myself and a lot of other people. I do own one today. We have both versions here. This is a 289 Cobra and totally restored. You know, just those cars are as timeless as you get. And then this is a 427 Cobra, and the 427s really got pretty awesome looking. They got the fenders got flared out and the body got a little wider, and of course they got a big engine, and they just they look like they're just kind of ready to drip everything right on the ground. And these cars are amazing because they were you know, just in the low 2,000 pound range, 400 plus horsepower in these cars. They literally would dust a Corvette in a second. I mean, there was no competition. And in fact, there was a story a long time ago where a Cobra would do 0 to 100 and back to 0 in 12 seconds. So really a timeless piece of history, especially when you tie Carroll Shelby to it. He's the one that made this car a reality for everybody to enjoy and drive. And I don't think I could ever get tired of a Cobra. All right, it's time to leave the showroom. We'll head to the museum and we'll see a bunch of race cars. So welcome to our museum. This museum is a collection of cars that I've been putting together for over 30 years. I've always been involved in racing, raced myself, and I've loved all forms of racing, from drag racing to road racing to Indianapolis to kind of you name it. I don't think there's any kind of racing I don't like. The museum really represents a variety of all these different disciplines. There's cars here from Pikes Peak, from drag racing, from NASCAR, from Le Mans, from Indy, etc. And we'll kind of walk through it, and I'll point out some of the different cars so you see what they are and can enjoy them. Okay, so the first car you see here, this is a car that was built at my shops in '79. We took this car to Pikes Peak, set a record with it at Pikes Peak in '79 or in 1980, and it was something I'd never done before, and we just wanted to do that. And that's when Pikes Peak was really a gravel road, which was pretty exciting. And it's a 1,000-pound car, has 400 horsepower, Porsche engine. It was a pretty fun time. And then as we go further, this whole line here, as you go down, you're going to see Porsches. I mean, again, I'm a Porsche fan, so we have a variety of Porsches. This first RSR, this was the first RSR built at Porsche. It was the factory team car. It won the championship and won the class at Le Mans. And I think this car's been in the collection since the 80s, so been here quite a while. The next Porsche is a single turbo Porsche 934.5. There were 10 of these cars built for IMSA. I actually purchased this car when it was used. It was a year old when I purchased it, had very few races on it. It was the first road race car that I actually raced professionally. And this car ended its career in '79, finishing third overall at the 24-hour Daytona. My co-drivers were Rick Mears and Monty Shelton, and none of us had ever been to Daytona, and we really had a bunch of fun doing that. The next Porsche is one of the last of the 935 era. This was one of Reinhold Jost's cars, a Liqui-Moly car, factory 935, with all the Jost body work that the factory authorized him to do. This car has a lot of race wins and podium finishes on it. And this was one of the coolest eras of road racing, because these cars were 750 horsepower. They slid around the corners. You drove them with a lot of throttle oversteer. They're really a beast, no question. The ultimate Porsches, the 917s, there's two of them here. The first car here is the Daytona winner from 1970. It was the first long distance win for the 917. It was a Gulf wire car driven by Pedro Rodriguez and Lee Kunneman and Brian Redmond. And there is no more beautiful car in the world, I don't think, than a Porsche 917. And in a lot of ways, there's no better performance car than a 917. The second 917 here is the Can-Am version. And the Can-Am version car was used in the Can-Am series in the United States and the Inter series in Europe. And these were basically the same chassis as the coupe you just saw, but the Can-Am version is wider because it has wider wheels and tires, a wider body. It has a twin turbo engine making over 1,200 horsepower. These cars, even by today's standards, are some of the fastest race cars of all time. They're 0 to 100 in 2.8 seconds. They were 0 to 150 in 5.5 seconds. And they were 0 to 200 in 10.8 seconds. And There's just not much that competes with that in terms of performance, not even today. And of course today cars have changed because of safety standards and all kinds of other restrictions, and in this era there was basically no rules, that you could kind of race whatever you could imagine. Then the last Porsche is the beginning of the era of ground effects cars. So this is a Porsche 962C. This was a championship car from Jack Ickx and Jochen Mass when they won the championship in the Rothman cars. Rothman was a factory sponsor for Porsche. This was a factory team car. These cars, even again by today's standards, are extremely fast. The cars, the newest race cars today have been slowed down some because of safety, but these cars generated 750 to 850 horsepower. They made, 5, 6, 7,000 pounds of downforce, and had incredible grip through the corners, and really was an era of the coolest looking prototype cars in the world. As we go through the rest of the museum, you just see a variety of things, again, because I like stuff. So this is an AMC Javelin, 1970. Roger Penske took over the AMC Javelin Factory Works racing program to race in Trans Am. This was a Trans Am car, driven first by Mark Donohue, then by Peter Revson. But this was a muscle car racing series, and it was a really exciting series then. It included Mustangs and Camaros and Dodge Challengers and Chargers and of course Javelin. So a little bit of everything. Pontiac Firebirds, all of it. And Roger, by the second year with the Javelin program, he won the championship with the car. So pretty cool car. This car here on the left, this is an H production, all original Austin Healey. It was in a garage in the Midwest. It raced at Elkhart Lake Racetrack, Road America, from 1959 to 1967. The guy towed it to the track with a trailer hitch, took the windshield off and raced it. And kind of the purest form of racing, you kind of load up your car, drag it down to the track, drive it, and drag it home, if you didn't wreck it. So, and then the car next to it is another of that era, where this is a Fiat 600 made into a race car by Abarth. These cars were 1,000 pounds, made 100 horsepower, won lots of races. They were actually extremely competitive. Very cool looking little cars, a very timeless look, this little box. So I just always like this kind of stuff. We'll flip over here. Open wheel cars. The Cooper here in front of me, this was Steve McQueen's car. It was originally the Cooper Championship car in Europe. Ken Tyrrell ran the team for John Cooper. They won the championship. The car at the end of that season was sold to Steve McQueen, who drove it a little bit in Europe and drove it in the United States until he needed to be making movies and not racing cars. But this was an early era open wheel car. These cars are light and nimble and fun and pretty timeless when you consider this is a 60s car. The car next to it is Dan Gurney's first Indy car. This is Chassis 01. This is the car he drove at Indianapolis in 1966. And this car raced actually 5 years at Indianapolis 500 in different configurations. And we were able to acquire this car, I think 3 or 4 years ago. And then we restored it complete ground up, so you see it in a completely fresh, restored state. Dan Gurney created All-American Racers, Southern California guys building race cars. Their quality was impeccable. Their designs were impeccable. This Eagle with the beak nose was one of the most beautiful Indy cars of all time, and extremely successful in that era. Over here we have a taste of NASCAR. So this is a 1969 Ford 427 Torino. 69 was the only year that Richard Petty drove Fords. He knew that the Dodge was not going to be competitive, the Chrysler product, against the Ford, so he switched over to Fords. He drove this car at Riverside in the Times 500 in 69 and won the race. And he drove Fords all the rest of that year. And then this car here is a sprint car. And I have to say that in my racing that I did over the years, all the different cars I got to drive, these were the most fun of anything I ever drove. A sprint car weighs approximately 1,200 pounds, has 850 horsepower. They had 800 horsepower even back then. They run on methanol, there's no transmission, you push them to start them, and you race on oval tracks, anything from a quarter mile to a mile. Oval, mostly dirt. This is all in dirt car configuration. You're sideways all the time. Sometimes you're upside down. but these are the most fun of anything I ever drove. And probably a sprint car teaches you more car control than anything in the world for driving. You know, Tony Stewart drove sprint cars, A.J. Foyt, Mario Andretti, Jeff Gordon. I mean, the list goes on and on. Most guys that were great race car drivers came out of something in the dirt like this. Now we got an example of a Bonneville car. So this car raced at Bonneville in 1953, was about over 170 miles an hour. I mean, this is a 33, 34 Ford body, chopped way down. You only needed to look forward. About 400 horsepower with a supercharged flathead Ford engine with Arden heads. You know, really, you know, this was the hot rod generation. This was a lot of guys from Southern California, you know, figuring out how to make cars go fast. That's probably one of the best examples of that right there. So this is an Audi. This is an R15 TDI. This is a contemporary race car. This entire car is made out of carbon fiber. This entire car has sophisticated electronics for everything from traction control to ABS to yaw to you name it. Performance maps everything. This is a diesel powered car. And these cars in just a few years basically won everything. They won every major race, including the 24-hour Le Mans. Nothing could compete with these cars for quite some time. This is the only example of one of these in a museum. The rest are still in the ownership of Audi at this point, but a really incredible piece of technology. And you can kind of see how race cars change. They got longer, bigger, wider, lower, and the entire design is really based on aerodynamics. So it's not somebody sitting down with a pencil and designing a pretty car. It's engineers and aerodynamicists saying this is what it needs to look like to go fast. This is a sports racer, and these cars, even by today's standards, are extremely quick. They were very light, they had great handling, made about 350 horsepower in a car that's just over 1,000 pounds. Really popular today in vintage racing. This was a championship car driven by Jochen Mass and George Burrell in the 70s. I think got 72. It was a world championship car. Just a really cool car. These cars are so simple. They're just, you know, if you talk about less is more, this is less is more right here. And then next to it, we have the complete extreme. We have, you know, in the heyday of NASCAR, this is a Dale Earnhardt car from 1987. This is chassis number 2. This is a super speedway car. So this was a 200-mile-an-hour brick, basically. These cars weigh 3,500 pounds, have about 800 horsepower back then, and very few limitations. I mean, if you could go 200, you went 200. This was the 200-mile-an-hour era in all their cars back then. And then here we have a 90s era IndyCar. IndyCars today have changed dramatically based on safety requirements. This is an era where they were building cars through the 80s and 90s, well, really earlier than that, but 70s, 80s, 90s, and the entire goal was to see how fast you could go. And this was a car that was built in an era where 230 mile an hour at Indianapolis 500 was kind of normal stuff. This car was driven by Arie Luyendyk. I think this car finished 3rd at Indianapolis back then, won the Phoenix Mile race in that era. This was a Granatelli car, so this was Vince Granatelli, and Arie drove for him. And these cars were just minimalist. The cockpit is just barely big enough for a driver. There's just barely enough car in the front for his feet. You know, there's just nothing on this car that doesn't need to be on this car for going fast. It's all about going fast. Then over here, we've got 3 cars of the 60s era for dirt and pavement. You know, this first car is a sprint car, a championship sprint car driven by a guy named Donnie Branson. He was as good as there was in these cars in that era. Unfortunately, didn't survive these cars. These cars, the fatality rate was fairly high. They were pretty dangerous. They were extremely fast. But this was a car that you know, people would have seen at Ascot Park in Southern California and in Carson area. If you went to Ascot in the 60s, you saw this car race with Donnie in the car. The next car is a dirt champ car. So these were a combination car. These cars raced on the mile at Terre Haute on a dirt track, and 2 days later they'd be on a 2-mile pavement track. This car raced not only at the Hoosier 100, it raced at the Indy 500. And it was as simple as changing the gear ratios, the torsion bars, the shocks, and the tires and the car was ready to go for the Indy 500. This was the Parnelli Jones car, had multiple wins at the Hoosier 100, was one of the last conventional cars to qualify for the Indy 500 before the Roadster era started. And that's what this is. This is an Indy Roadster. So the next generation of cars after that was the Roadster. And the Roadster was low. The engine was that same engine, that Offenhauser engine, was moved to one side in the car so that the driver could sit really low on the other side of the car. And it's funny because you're up against the wall. You're closer to it instead of farther. But that was the whole idea, was to get the engine, get everything down, get the driver down, get the aerodynamics better. And these Indy Roadsters, to me, are some of the most beautiful air Indy cars ever built. They're just timeless looking. And these cars back then, these were a 130, 140 mile an hour car down the straightaway in Indianapolis. So they weren't slow by any means. This is a top fuel dragster from the late 60s. This took the bravest of all dragster drivers to drive these. The engine was in front of you, making 3,000 horsepower on nitro. Things would blow up and come back towards your face. Fire came back towards your face. Parts came back towards your face. I mean, this really was an era of really brave guys. You sat in the seat with the differential right in front of you, and the axles. I mean, literally, your legs went over the axle housing. And this particular car was driven by a really good friend of mine. This was Don Prudhomme, Don the Snake Prudhomme. This was a car he drove. He drove a number of these cars. In that era, he won, God, you can't count how many races he won. He was pretty much fearless in this era in these cars, and he had to be. And I was fortunate in that we were able to get this car from the owners. Don restored this car in its entirety with a lot of the same guys that were involved when it was built new. You know, from Ed Pink rebuilt the engine, and Don Long restored the chassis back, and the original painters and the original tin guys. There at least 4 of the guys that were part of this car in the 60s were part of it 3 years ago when it went through the restoration. So this car means a lot to me. Don and I are good friends, like I said, and he's come up here we've taken this downstairs for cars and coffee and fired it off, and it's if you've ever heard a dragster run, it's pretty exciting to hear one of these things rattle off 3,000 horsepower. And the last 2 cars in the museum we'll look at here is from the GT era, GTX era, Group 4, different things, Group 5, extreme opposites, but they raced against each other. This is a 935. This is the last of the Series 935s built. This is a K4. Kremer built this car. This is an 800 horsepower car. John Fitzpatrick drove this car in the United States. Bob Wallach drove it in Europe under different sponsorship, but he drove it in Europe. This car has a lot of race wins. I think 6 in the US alone in IMSA. John and I are friends. We actually drove together before, and John said by far the K4 was the fastest, best 935 ever built. And he proved it. I mean, he raced against GTP cars with ground effects and beat them on numerous occasions. This car is a Lancia, and Lancia got involved in road racing and built this really cool looking car. I love this box, and it's got a 4-cylinder turbo engine. They went for a small motor and a very light package. The car is extremely light, very nimble. They were very successful. You know, they lacked a little bit of reliability. That's part of Italian cars, but they definitely had the performance and the looks and all the other stuff that goes with cool race cars.